My bad. All right, so to the beginning. Introduction. And thank you so much for that wonderful introduction.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for coming tonight. I know it's late and everyone has responsibilities, so I appreciate your attendance in this matter. It was a powerful, difficult book to write, so haunted. Everyone had written Jeremy Ellis off. Maybe that is why he began to haunt me. It started about 2 weeks before I was scheduled to interview Jeremy's daughter, Jade Ellis. I could not sleep at night. Intrusive thoughts seemed to take over my research and writing. I had strange dreams of people dying. The police were involved. I wondered if I was being triggered by studying police violence. I grew up in the 1980s and 90s in San Francisco's Mission District. At that time, the Latina community I came from in the Mission lived in fear, stemming both from street gang beefs that made it difficult to walk from one block to the next, and from the police, who were known for their abuse and violence. Coming from a family of Puerto Ricans who practiced Afro-Caribbean religions made my childhood especially anxious. I had the additional concern that we would be seen as an evil cult. I learned the hard way that the police were also a real danger. When I began to conduct research on the policing and criminalization of Afro-Caribbean religions in the United States, I was aware that research can impact the scholar. People do not usually speak much about the toll that the research of traumatic phenomena can take on the mental health of researchers themselves. I chalked up the difficulty I was having in writing this book to the subject itself. It certainly evoked strong emotions in me. Still, I could not shake the feeling that there was more to this research that was haunting me. The haunting started when I was researching the policing of Afro-Latina religions and came across a little-known cause of death classification called Excited Delirium syndrome. Medical examiners have used the syndrome when assigning cause to the unexplained deaths of mostly Black and Latina men killed during police interactions. To me, it sounded made up. The term itself was troubling, but as I looked into the scientific explanations of the syndrome, it seemed even more problematic. I found that excited delirium syndrome was a controversial diagnosis for people who are said to have exhibited superhuman strength, are considered impervious to pain, are said to have become aggressive, excited, sweaty, and agitated, and who then suddenly up and died, as police officers have been known to say. In this context, police officers are seen as innocent bystanders who just happened to witness the unexplainable deaths of so-called criminals who are subsequently written off as having caused their own deaths. However, almost all of these deaths occurred during police interactions, and they almost always involve police use of force, such as hog-tying people, applying carotid chokeholds, kneeling on people's bodies, stunning them with tasers, injecting with sedatives, or imposing forceful restraints. After I learned of excited delirium syndrome, I could not get it out of my head. It was as if I saw excited delirium syndrome everywhere. In 2020, my eldest son, Neto, purchased his first home. His family chose Antioch, California, whose rolling hills, warmer climate, and suburban houses promise relief from the everyday violence of city living. That same year in Antioch, on December 23rd, just 2 days before Christmas, a brown-skinned 30-year-old Filipino man named Angelo Quinto was killed during a police interaction. Medical examiners claimed Quinto's death was caused by excited delirium syndrome. Multiple officers at the scene had knelt on Quinto's body until he ceased to struggle. When paramedics arrived, Quinto was purple and unresponsive, and he had blood coming from his nose. Just 7 months earlier, the world was rocked by videos of the death of George Perry Floyd, who, like Quinto, had also been knelt on by multiple officers before dying in police custody. amid worldwide protests and demands for police accountability during the peak of the COVID-19 pandemic, the justice system took a serious look into Floyd's death, leading to officers being charged. A little-known fact is that police and attorneys described both Quinto and Floyd as having allegedly exhibited excited delirium syndrome. I became obsessed with excited delirium syndrome. As I looked into death after death, the syndrome took over the early months of my fellowship at Stanford University. I did not realize then that it was possible I was being haunted. What felt like an unexpected rabbit hole in my research had become so much more. I'll stop there and have a discussion with Michael. Oh, I have to take this off, right? Is that right?
It's good to hear it in your own voice.
Thanks.
I'm excited about this book. I think I was worried about reading this book at first. Initially, so I had never heard of Excited Delirium until I read this book, and I appreciate, which is maybe strange. And I think that as a 47-year-old black man, I think my gut reaction right now says I thought that I would have, particularly because I've been paying attention to American history and race relations, that nothing would sort of shock me anymore. But the number of F-bombs that I have written throughout the text, like, because I didn't have any better way of expressing what I was reading and how I was feeling. And there's this kind of build-up throughout the book that sort of charges you. By the time I'm at the end, I'm just really angry. No, don't be sorry. Don't be sorry. But it's a useful angry. It's a kind of an anger that has spurred me to want to go back and start a work that I had once been doing and had kind of given up doing because I kind of felt like I understand what it means to be black in America. But there's a reminder here that there's just still so much that I just didn't really know. Some of the books you cite in here are books that I have on my shelf that is like, oh, one day I'll read this, but I'm like, no, I should have already read this by now. So I have a lot, but I try to narrow it down to a few questions, so we'll just see how it goes. But I just want to ask you first, so actually let me, before I ask you the more important question, there's a point in which you wrote an article in here, and I forget the title, and it's in here, I circled it somewhere. But you didn't name the book that. Like you named that you had this title of the book and it had something of, I think it even had the title Excited Delirium somewhere in there in the title, and you gave a talk on that particular article, or the talk that you gave had a different title. And I wonder if you remember the title, if it's just popping in your head what I'm talking about. I think in this particular talk, there was a guy who made a comment about Einstein. I don't know if you remember that talk, because I usually don't remember the talk titles.
Yeah.
But I wonder why you changed it. Like why this one is fine. This is.
Yeah.
But the other one seemed a little more like in your face, if I remember it properly.
Okay. So he's pointing to, actually, while I was writing the book, I was at CASBIS, which is this center at Stanford for people to, just take a year and write their books.
Right.
With a group of other scholars who are doing social scientific approaches.
Right.
And so it was the first time I ever actually presented on the material, and you'll be probably not surprised to hear that no one in the room had heard of excited delirium syndrome there, and it's almost fascinating to me how many times I've given talks at criminal justice, as with events with scholars who study criminal justice, no one has heard of excited delirium syndrome. The few places that people have heard about it is like paramedics, like medical doctors,
right.
But outside of the medical field, criminal justice scholars, this has completely just gone under the radar. And I think it was shocking to me and appalling to me that I stumbled upon this
Right.
as I was doing this other research, right, on the policing and criminalizing of Santeria. So when I gave that talk, I was still writing the other book, and I decided to present what I thought at the time was a chapter of the other book that became this entire book.
Okay.
And so that was the title of the chapter that I had given it at the time.
I see.
And it was sort of couched in the larger project, which I ended up taking, and that's the other book that's that I cut this in half, basically. It was 600 pages, and my husband said, "Don't do that. Split it in half and publish 2 books." And I said, "Okay, that makes sense." So this book then focused entirely on excited delirium syndrome, and I think I had mentioned to you, when I made that space, right, when I took out half of the book, I was able to really go back and think about how to present this, you know, in how to humanize it in a way, and part of it was part of the work of humanizing a lot of death and a lot of people's deaths in the book, and the way that it impacted me, and I know that it impacts people who have read the book, was to try and offer you know, a pathway through the narrative, through the stories, with my own approach as a scholar who was traumatized through my research, right? And like having that, waking up and having nightmares and really just feeling like, how can I do this work? And so I offer that in the book, and that was like something that I added in later.
Okay.
To change it. So it did change significantly from that version, which is why it didn't
Okay.
have that same title. But
You'll see it when you get your hands on the book. But so let me ask you the broader set of questions that I had already thought about. So one, maybe we should just talk about what Excited Delirium is, but then two, I don't know if I should hold that or not, but I feel like you should just hold it because, you know.
okay, we can both of it.
Okay.
Oh, there's
Oh,
another.
just
And you
kidding.
guys
You
can
can hear
hear
me
us.
clearly anyways.
Right.
Okay, so maybe you should say though what Excited Delirium is.
Yeah.
And then can you maybe just tell us what made you want to write this book?
Yeah.
This is certainly not the average, I mean, it's on Duke University Press, but it's not the
Right.
standard academic book.
Right. Yes, that's purposeful. Right. I really, really wanted to make it readable to a wide audience, because similar to your response and reaction, when I discovered Excited Delirium syndrome, it was shocking to me that it wasn't like everywhere and people weren't talking about it, and there was not a lot of publicity around it, and nor awareness, both in like, you know, in terms of scholarship, but then why did it just sort of disappear from even public discourse, right? And so that was really surprising to me, which is why I ended up titling the book Excited Delirium, was to sort of get it out there and really have people talking about it. What is it, right? So Excited Delirium is a term that has been used and has operated as a diagnosis, and really as a death classification. And it was created by a medical examiner in Miami in the 1980s. And that's how I came upon this, because I was studying the criminalizing of Afro-Cuban religions. And this man, Charles Wheatley, who coined the term Excited Delirium syndrome, also was a sort of makeshift so-called expert on Afro-Caribbean cults for law enforcement. And so I was doing research on the criminalizing of Afro-Cuban religions, and his name kept coming up because he was the one who was being paid to do trainings for law enforcement on Afro-Cuban religions in the 80s after the Mariel boat lift, the 1980 Mariel boat lift. And so I started looking into him, and a number of the people that I had been interviewing, a number of the law enforcement specialists who had been doing these trainings, worked with him. And it was, interestingly enough, at the same time that I was doing these trainings, I was also interviewing practitioners of Afro-Cuban Santeria who were utilizing their spiritual practices as a form of activism, right? And so a number of the people in my community had been doing rituals that, like, at locations where people have been murdered by the police, with the family members of like Mario Woods or Oscar Grant, in order to both calm the areas, right? So these locations that are left with this heavy taint of like death, and then also the community members and the family members. And so using these traditions as healing techniques for the larger community. So I was doing research with practitioners when I came upon this, and as well as with police officers. And so that was the sort of dual ethnographic research. And what happened was I was told I needed to interview Jade Ellis. Actually, my son said, you really should talk to this person. She's gonna be a priest soon. She's going through initiation, and she has a really important story. And I had no idea what her story was, but you know, thought, let me just go talk to her and see what's happening. And it was within the 2 weeks that I was preparing to interview Jade that I had made my own discovery of Excited Delirium syndrome, and I became really obsessed with it. And I started having these recurring dreams with this figure. And when the moment that I go to interview Jade Ellis, which is what I kind of start the book with, it turns out her father was an Excited Delirium. And what's even more interesting is when she tells me, she said, that her father was in Excited Delirium, that moment was like sort of crystallized for me, because it was a moment where I had been sort of having these experiences where Excited Delirium was everywhere, and then all of a sudden I go meet this random person who I'm told I need to meet, and her father was in Excited Delirium, and not only that, I had been seeing him in my dreams. So she sent me photos of him afterwards, after that night, and it was the same person that had been appearing in my dreams. And so that was why I say, your father haunted me.
Right.
And in that moment, she started laughing, and she said, "Oh, he's so annoying."
I love your interaction. I love your interaction, by the way. The description, it feels like you two are family when you first meet.
Right.
Okay, so ask this question out of order because I think it makes sense given what you just said. There's this sense that we are following you in the discovery, which is not the way that scholars tend to write their work. Even ethnographies are not written in this way where we're following you. And I think initially it was disorienting for me because I just had an expectation for how the book should go based on what I normally read. But then very quickly it was like, oh no, I'm just gonna follow you to see where we go next.
Right.
But what led you to write it that way? I mean, I can think of benefits.
Yeah.
I can't think of very many costs, but I can think of a lot of benefits for writing it that way. But what led you to do it that way?
Well, it was a difficult decision so Michael's referring to in the book, I include my journal entries as a way to both enter into the conversation around how I was grappling with this experience of being haunted by the research and the people that I was researching, and to sort of at the same time allow people into my own process as someone who's born and raised in a practice that does acknowledge the existence of non-material beings, right? So in a lot of spiritual practices, right, and the one that I come from, in Afro-Caribbean religions, our parents and grandparents are always ingraining in us the spirits and the way that they interact with people. And so whether or not it was because of that I was more open to allow it or not, there is something valuable in what it means to be like a person of color doing scholarship, right? And how that then situates you in a particular way to your research subjects. And so my location, putting myself in the book the way that I did, was also its own kind of, and not to be too academic, like decolonial approach, right? Like, how do we undo a certain kind of expectation of what scholarship is supposed to look like? And so part of the journey that I take you on is a kind of disruption of Western academic writing, right? And also storytelling patterns, right? And so I really tried to fall back on the way that, like, I see both, my family members, elders in the community, and the way that they tell stories as valid and valuable knowledge. And so allowing those stories to guide how this book unfolds is also a way to bring you ethnographically into a kind of cultural perspective that you might not have been ever have access to, right? And to do that in a way, and I think I mentioned this to you before, Toni Morrison often talked about what it meant for her to do books where the protagonist is a black girl. Yeah. And how when you embody a black girl in the book, that changes fundamentally how you as a reader identify yourself when you're reading the text, right? You're able to a certain degree, obviously not completely, but you're able to embody in a certain way, right, this person's experience. And I took that inspiration from Toni Morrison because, thank you for the wonderful introduction, but like I have been able to become, through my scholarship, a pretty celebrated scholar. And I felt like if people would feel probably through the process, they would begin to embody me in the reading of the text. And that in and of itself was doing a kind of shift of what the traditional white Western ethnographer is supposed to look like.
I'll tell you, you accomplished that beautifully. There are many moments where throughout the book. First of all, there's a bunch of like some real quotables here. You know, I'm always looking for the one-liners that later on I'll put. And I'm teaching the social violence this semester, and I wish I would have had this ahead of time, because I think I would have absolutely assigned it for this class. But there are moments what's happening throughout the book is we're following you as you discover what's happening next, what's the next point, what's the next thing.
Right.
Here's how I got connected to this person, and then you're taking us into your mind and to your emotion of, so before each chapter, introducing a reflection that you put in, and then, so I don't know where this is going, but I'm following you and having these moments where I'm getting a thought like, okay, I know how she's gonna see this. And so even if I'm wrong, but just being able to embody that, so to the extent that I can, your perspective, I just thought it was particularly powerful. So you mentioned his name, Whetley.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know if I've ever hated somebody so much. As a Black American person, it's hard for me I really learned to hate this person.
Oh my goodness, that's interesting. I
I
tried to humanize him.
No, you tried. And there's a moment throughout the book where you don't ever, I should say, this is the thing that I think most skillful about your writing. You don't come out and say, you should hate this person.
Mm-hmm.
And even there's a moment throughout, sort of towards the middle end of the book, where you say, maybe this person, maybe he made like a change of heart.
Right.
And I said the same thing to myself, maybe Charles is changing.
Right.
And no, Charles was not changing at all. But I like the fact that I was with you in that moment of discovery.
Right.
But so Charles Whetley, he has this sense of, he becomes the intersection for all these other things that are going on. So I have two questions around him.
Yeah.
One,
Yeah.
it strikes me that it seems, I can see that being problematic for you personally. I wonder if you felt any kind of difficulty around him being the intersection, because so many other things that you end up discussing are discussed through him.
Right.
But at the same time, we needed that in order to make those different connections between all the different types of groups, and I'll have to ask a question about that later on. But I wonder how you just felt emotionally about the idea that he's so important. He has this kind of
Yeah.
Forrest Gump feel about him, where if you've seen the movie Forrest Gump, you know that Forrest has affects all of world history. Except this is a real person who actually builds industry
Right.
and affects the way that we
Yeah.
do policing in American society.
Well, what I found really interesting about this is how small the medical examiner circle is in the United States. There's about less than 500 medical examiners. They know each other very, very well. It's a very tight-knit group, and they control a lot, right? And I thought that was fascinating, because the only two organizations that acknowledge Excited Delirium was the National Medical Examiners Association and the Emergency Physicians Association, right? Who just recently reversed that, but they were the only two that acknowledged Excited Delirium, right? So AMA didn't, APA didn't, World Health didn't. I mean, no one else acknowledged it. But because these two organizations did, it allowed it to be used as a death classification. And still, it is on the books in many states. So Colorado, California, Florida, and New York are the ones so far who have banned its use, but it's still being used, and also not just across the United States, but across the UK, Canada, and I was even told in the Caribbean the other day someone was killed and it was similarly used. So it's so I thought that was really fascinating, and what emerges through him is what we see is a tight network of an industry that allows for someone and people in this network to basically make a lucrative career off of dual sides of the law enforcement, legal, medical complex, right? And that's something that I think he reveals because of the way he operates as a figure, but he's not the only one, right? And what we see is that, and as you guys, are probably aware, Excited Delirium has been used as the justification for taser-related deaths. And so Taser International at the time, now it's Axon, purchased 1,000 copies of a book that was based off of Whetley's theories, Excited Delirium syndrome, and basically gave it to every medical examiner in the country, right? Twice over, right? So and was able to utilize Excited Delirium syndrome as as a defense successfully in 29 of 30 cases, wrongful death lawsuits against Taser International. What's interesting about this is Wheatley is a major researcher for Taser. So he's paid to research and establish that it's Excited Delirium and not Taser, right? And Wheatley's students and Wheatley's friends are all doing this research paid for by Taser, but they are also paid as expert witnesses, which, you know,
very
is
well too.
Right, very well. So this industry, right, is really a lucrative and, you know, kind of underground, I think, important anchor of why, you know, Excited Delirium has gone under the ground for so long and why it's so useful. Because on the one hand, it reveals both the, you know, obviously, you know, the racism and structural racism and how it's, you know, deeply embedded in medical practices. But the relationship between law enforcement and medical practitioners and the legal system, right? Because why Excited Delirium is so helpful is it makes the cases disappear. They just go away. Once that classification is on there, it's an accident, right? And so we know with, you know, George Floyd's death, the first thing that was put on the website was man dies of medical incident, right? And had it not been for the bystander footage, we could not have known that it was a medical incident. And so, and of course there's still the rhetoric that it could be Excited Delirium, and Excited Delirium was used in Chauvin's trial, right? So Excited Delirium syndrome is this really crucial sort of nexus that links them all together, and Wheatley gives us that insight in a way that I think, you know, it was shocking, right, to continue to come back to him and how, you know, so many times he comes up, right?
Yeah. That was actually the part that kept giving us, like, I started at some point writing, this guy again? So here we are again, we get led down some road and we discover some other thing. I started keeping notes during the book. I mean, my book is just full of notes anyways, but towards the end, I started keeping track of all of the different actors who were involved in this.
Yeah.
So you've got police, you've got EMT, you've got a buildup of industry that you were just talking about. Some of them make $500 to $1,000 an hour.
Yeah.
You've got courts, you've got politicians, and they're all involved in this conspiracy that is not hidden.
Nope.
That's underlaid with, or sort of like overlaid with, or just deeply embedded with, or in bed with this reinvention of or not even reinvention, but this continuation of eugenics. Mm-hmm. And I wonder, for you, did it feel like, oh my, because you don't come out and say this is a grand conspiracy, but I kept writing it in the, you know, you would say these people are collaborating, these different actors, but I want to say this is a goddamn conspiracy, like literally to kill and then to make these lives go away. And I wonder, I was left with this feeling of just complete outrage and anger, even in a time when outrage is very common in American society. This was really outrageous for me. But I wonder how you felt making these connections.
Yeah. No, it was overwhelming. Like I said, so, you know, part of my journey also is a pushback against reform, right? So I start off with this relationship to policing where a number of practitioners who were police officers of Santeria and Haitian, Vodun, had come to me when I was at Harvard. This is how I started the research at the first place. And they had asked, would I help them reinvigorate these trainings that had been done in the 1990s after the Supreme Court ruled in favor of Santeria being a constitutional religion and so on. There was a number of police trainings that Wheatley started
which is the same
in Miami. And what was interesting is I was asked to come down to Miami by police officers to help support these police officers re-educate people, because they noticed, this was in 2012, right after Trayvon Martin was killed, that there was a kind of renewal of racial angst. And so there was a sense that they wanted an expert, like, and asked me to come. And so I was there observing, you know, trying to figure out in what way I was comfortable working with police, how I could do that work. And so I did a lot of participant observation of police academies, police trainings, interviews with police officers and so on, with the understanding that I was sort of building up towards potentially working with them, but never really understanding what my collaboration would ultimately look like. So it was kind of first doing an assessment of like what was happening on the ground. And that's what this other book is
Okay.
details, is all of that research. But so through that process, I started off with an understanding of police reform and like the ways that police reform could be useful, right? And sort of trying to think about how do we talk to police officers, how do we train differently, how do we, right, analyze. But then this book happened to me, right? And it took me through a kind of a sense of existential crisis. And I don't want to give it away, give away the ending, but I will say that I strongly argue that Excited Delirium isn't this syndrome, right, that, Black and brown people have. He argued it was a genetic defect in the body that made Black people spontaneously die on small amounts of cocaine or methamphetamines. That's the argument. Like, that's the actual argument that Wheatley made, that it was it's a genetic defect, and that's why, and this has been rehashed, like we saw it in LA with Daryl Gates, the chief of police, who said Black men were particularly susceptible to having their windpipes crushed, right, in the 90s, right? So this has been, there's always been these kinds of arguments, right? But what I came to realize at a certain point in the book and all through the research is Excited Delirium is the racist gaze that criminalizes and demonizes Black people to a sense of, it's like, that's the society has the Excited Delirium, right? And so we have to disrupt that Excited Delirium, right? Which is tied back to the tropes of slavery and eugenics, right? And that's so deeply ingrained that this kind of fabricated diagnosis can continue to operate in plain sight. But then also, and this is the part where, I'm sympathetic to the idea of conspiracy, but because of all the people that I interviewed who deeply, deeply believe this, there is a level of not necessarily ignorance, but there's like a wholehearted subscription to it, right? To these kinds of eugenic arguments, and that's where I feel is an Excited Delirium.
Yeah, I had a hard time with that. I wrote that in the margins at one point. Like, do you believe? Like, not you, but
Right.
Responding to someone, like, do you believe what you're saying here? This makes no sense. Do you believe it? But I would, you're right. There's moments in which you describe that on the scene, the EMTs, the officers are talking about. So when I hear people talking about the excuse for what they've already done, to me, I feel like you know what you've done. I have a hard time. There's a line from Du Bois back in like 1906, 1907 when he talks about all of the experiences that Black people have had, and he notes, he's like, at this point, no white person can say that they don't understand the basic humanity of Black people, and that's 1907. So now here we are in 2024, and I'm thinking, no way do you not know.
Right.
One other thing that the book does, and I told myself I wasn't gonna get too excited and just talk about the book, but then I was just gonna ask you more questions. But it forces us to see a continuum of belief, like not a continuum, but a continuance of beliefs. Eugenics, in particular, the same old beliefs that once said the boxer Jack Johnson was weak in the stomach because he was Black, those same kinds of racialized beliefs. And I wanted to ask you more about, like, thinking about this racial laboratory. So I like the concept, but I wonder, maybe you can describe it and talk a little bit more about it. Talk about how you want to see it used and further.
I'm actually developing a more academic version of the.
I like it the way it's in here, though.
You like it in there, yeah. So the racial laboratory, interestingly enough, was what the title. Well, I think it was in the title.
I think it was in the title before.
Yeah. So that was in the title of the.
So I'm like, why is this not in here?
So I tried to not make this so academic that it would be off-putting to people because I really wanted it to be readable. But the way that I see the racial laboratory is that there is a kind of series of practices, right, that establish something that is completely irrational and racial and racist as a fact through what looks to be like a credentializing, right? And this takes up both like scientific practice, a kind of Western authority, the way that people operate within certain medical establishments and fields, but also within academics, right? And so I realized through even our own identities as scholars, we participate in a kind of reproduction of expertise. And I was really worried about that, and I was worried about that because the figure of the expert itself, to me, is itself a kind of embodied whiteness, right? A location that you have to operate from, which is why when you read that, you're like, wait a minute, this is not what you're supposed to sound like when you sound like a scholar, right? And so the concept of the racial laboratory is really thinking about how, even the slave ship itself, right, was a site of experimentation, right, where medical doctors experimented on, black bodies to think about disease and and humans and how people interact. And so like the slave ship, the plantation, the sort of police interaction, the medical the doctor's office, when we think about like Samuel Cartwright, the production of gynecology and black women being experimented on to create these experts. And Wheatley used Afro-Cubans, right? And so he was dissecting, he had a whole collection of Afro-Cuban bodies that he was just sort of playing with, and studying their tattoos, and making all of these really ridiculous, as someone who studies, Afro-Caribbean religions, all these ridiculous associations that were just completely fabricated, but because he could publish them, they were used by law enforcement as the truth, right? And so these studies that he published with his Cuban informant, who ended up becoming an interlocutor of mine in the book, sort of traces the way, and what I try to do is reveal, kind of unpack what we think medical sciences or diagnoses are, and kind of show the guts for you to see, like, this is all fabricated, right? Like, this is not, and so we give this expertise, this credential, so much authority. And it's really important to question that. Even the idea of the diagnosis, right? So like a syndrome is a grouping of assumptions really based off of people's complaints of symptoms, but it's not anything that you can test for, about, right? And so the way a syndrome works is literally what people say happened to someone after they've died. And in the case of Excited Delirium, it's police officers whose accounts are what diagnose someone as excited delirium. And so it's really crucial that we even think about that aspect of like how the racial laboratory reproduces this kind of fabricated diagnosis.
So, okay, let me just say, and maybe I'll talk to you later on about this, but I feel like whatever fears you may have had about how this would be received, I think you quelled them pretty quickly throughout the book. I have one more question, and then one other, maybe a more personal question. So just think about the time, and to give you all time to ask questions, but if you don't have any, I got plenty. So there's this marrying of religion. Actually, before I say, let me make one other comment. There's that moment where you're talking about how the police, and you're going down there to help to train police officers who asked for you to be down there, who are noticing this uptick in criminalizing Santeria. It struck me that nobody criminalizes Christianity in the same way. I can think of a lot of examples in which somebody was Christian, and no one just says, this is a dangerous religion that we need to think about. Anyways, it's just a point. It struck me. As I was reading, I was like, no one's doing this, but all right. But there's this marrying of your own religion as method, as social science. And at one point during that interaction, with the guy, the Einstein guy, who makes the comment, there's a person who asks her a question during a talk, and he says, I'm with Einstein, and he ends up, by the way, you almost jerked a tear out of me when I got to the end of that sentence. Almost, I refused. My masculinity didn't allow me to have it yet.
Einstein gave you
It was
tear?
no, it was because you came full circle with it later on,
Yeah.
and I wasn't expecting that. And that's where my last question will go. But so I wondered how I agree that with his initial perspective, that I agreed almost wholly with his initial perspective. Like, how are you going to do this? And then also, and that is to marry religion as a method of social science to trouble the waters of epistemology. What constitutes knowledge? But you do it, you accomplish it. But I'm wondering, what did you need in order to write that way, to do it that way? Because it's not normal for social scientists. It is a risk. So I was wondering, what were your thought processes, and how did you feel about sort of accomplishing that?
Well,
That's a lot.
That's a big question. That's a big question. I'm still impressed that the Einstein guy got you, because the funny thing is that was, I put that in there because so he's a skeptic, right? And he's skeptical. He says, I wholeheartedly, your theory is unswallowable.
Yeah, he actually wrote that. He actually said that.
He said it, and I have the video, so I verbatim quoted him.
Oh, I figured.
Yeah. I verbatim quoted it. It's unswallowable, which I was like, ooh, that's painful. So I was like, I'm gonna put that in the book for sure. But so I wanted to tackle it head on, right? Because so the critique is, he goes, I'm a old white empiricist, and I just don't. I buy everything else about the whole Excited Delirium stuff you're writing about, but why are you bringing up spirits? Like, this is just unswallowable for me, right? And what's funny about that moment is I had a prepared response, but I didn't use my prepared response at first. The first thing that came out of my mind popped into my head, and I have no reason I really literally don't know, how this came out. But I just leaned into the microphone, and I watched it so many times. It's just so bizarre.
I need to see that, by the way, because I had an image in my mind of what it must have looked like.
I leaned into the microphone, and I said to him, well, I'm not going to convince you that spirits exist, but maybe they'll come visit you in your dreams tonight. And I started laughing, and then I caught myself, and I said, part of the critique of Western empiricism is, going to always, make any kind of Black or African spiritual practice the alter ego of Western Eurocentrism, and that's like implicitly part of the argument. But as ethnographers, if we're going to say that we are truly understanding our research subjects, and our research subjects are saying that they engage with spirits actively, then how, as social scientists, do we not take that seriously at all and pursue? So that was what I actually ended up saying at the end. But it kept bothering me. One, because he made a comment about him being with Einstein, and he did use Einstein, right? And he said, and Einstein was a professor at Princeton, so I felt particularly aggrieved, but also because he had gotten the story wrong. He had said Einstein was against spirits. That's not true. And it bothered me so much that I went afterwards, and I was like, that's not true. I vividly recall. And I was right. I went back and I looked it up, and it's true. Einstein was actually very, very much into psychics and clairvoyance, and he was even good friends with Upton Sinclair and offered to write the intro, and I write about all that in the book. But what's fascinating, so I was prepared. When he emailed me, he's like, we should have a lunch to discuss this.
I couldn't wait, by the way. When I got to that point, I was like, oh shit, where's this going?
Right. So I was very excited about this moment, because I was going to give him his Einstein, right, and all the proof that I had that he was on the wrong side of Einstein. But when we sat down and started having the lunch, and the director of the center, very famous political philosopher, political scientist, was with us, and she was playing devil's advocate because she has a connection to Aboriginal art, and she was telling me that the way that I was talking about my theories reminded her of the way her Aboriginal artists speak about their sculptures and how they're not sculptures, but they're actual people and their presences and so on. So anyways, we got into this whole conversation about that. Should I reveal this?
I don't know, because I'm this is
a moment, right?
This is, like, so you said earlier on, just as a moment, so earlier on, you said, I'm not giving away the end. So I'm also not asking questions about the end on purpose.
Yeah.
But this also.
This is a moment, so
This is
maybe
a
I
thing.
shouldn't give this away.
Don't
Have you read it?
No, we'll get there.
You'll get there.
We'll
Okay,
get there.
I'm not gonna give it away then.
Okay.
I'll let's just say he and I had our conversation, and
Yeah.
it was an interesting moment. But
But religion as method.
But religion is method. So I guess there's a way in which I couldn't have done this work if I wasn't being truly honoring of the fact that this was co-written by, Jeremy Ellis, Jade's father, right, who was haunting me, and all of the other spirits who were part of the book, and allowing their presence is how that is what it is, right? And they're deeply in the book, so much in so many ways that even in the, I don't know if you get a chance to read the acknowledgments, but while
Yes.
my copy, so I had sent this to a copy editor who I had never met before, someone I just hired because at the last minute I was like, okay, I need to have a copy editor, and this woman was recommended, and she wrote me this note saying that she had been unable, first she sent me a note and she said, who do I need to speak to get this to work? And I'm like, what do you mean? And she's like, what spirits or energies do I need to? And she's like, are there specific ones? And I'm like, what are you talking about? And she said that she was unable to actually access the book or get into it until she said, okay, to all the spirits who are in this book, I honor you and respect you, and I will do my best job to ensure that your stories are represented. And so then she could open it up. And I said, can I put that in the acknowledgments? Would you be okay with that? And she said, okay.
Be
and
careful talking to a scholar.
she was really
You'll end up in the
uncomfortable.
book, yes.
You'll end up in the
Yes.
book, yes. I always ask permission. I don't never do it without permission. But I included it in the book because I really do feel like that's part of the method, is like being able to acknowledge and honor that. And that does come from being a decolonial scholar and being able to stand from like a particular epistemology and honor that epistemology. Like I've learned, all of the like white Western, canon.
Right.
But I also have my own canon from which to draw from.
So okay, I don't know where I fall in it. I'm sorry. I had spent did hard time being a Christian. It's probably the wrong way to say that. I miss the music. I miss the culture. But I remember when I first had what I might call an encounter where you realize like, oh, I'm black and it means something and it doesn't mean anything good in American society. So I need to figure out who I am. And most of us will start off going back to Africa. We'll go to West Africa in our minds symbolically, and we'll go to East Africa, we'll go to ancient Egypt and Kumt and so on and so forth. And then being a part of the African student programs as an undergrad, I remember us, we would have a plant of some sort, and we would pour libations, and we would call forth the name of some person and say, just to remember this person, and we yell out, Ashe, let it be so.
Yeah.
This is a very common thing. I've done this with my wife for her father.
Yeah.
But I kind of got away from that. And in recent months, my wife and I have been talking about this, that sometimes I just hear my grandmother's voice off in the distance, but it scares me because it's like very clear, like I hear her voice. Sometimes at the corner of my eye, I'll see a child or I'll see just some presence. Right. And then my wife and I went to Italy, and then my sister-in-law stayed in the house, and then she said, yeah, I'm just chatting. She's like, man, there's something in your house, right? Just trying to be funny. But I don't know what to do about this. And what happened was when I was reading your book, it brought me to tears. Nearly, it didn't drop, because I had this moment of like, I wonder what I'm ignoring. Even in class today, when I was talking about it to my class, like, hey, y'all should come. Even then, I didn't allow myself to have this emotion. I just kind of thought about it, and I didn't know necessarily what I wanted to say to you about it. I just wanted to say that it touched me in a way that I hadn't expected to be touched. I would have been completely like, oh, this is not something you can do. I'm much more positivistic in my approach to social science. But this really, I don't know, man, it really helped to break something loose. I don't know what necessarily, I don't know what to do with it. But I think I have been ignoring something. I don't know what it's gonna lead me to do later on. Maybe nothing, maybe something. But yeah.
That's like a huge compliment. I mean, thank you for
No,
sharing
thank you. I would-
that. Thank you for
Yeah.
sharing that.
That the way you put that together in the book, you'll see when you get there. It'll be very obvious to you. There's many moments like that that are very obvious. That when you get there, it's only obvious though, I should say, because you're a skillful writer. So really great social science, really good writing, makes things that are very complex seem very simple. And then after the fact, it seems like obvious, like oh, of course, but it wasn't oh, of course.
Right.
But for me to be touched in this kind of spiritual way that I had kind of given up on
Yeah.
for any number of reasons.
Yeah.
I don't know. It just it made me think about how I might respond next time I hear my voice call,
Mm-hmm.
and what I might do and what I might think about going
Wow.
forward. So
That's,
I appreciate that.
that's
Thank you.
amazing. I feel like I'm gonna cry.
No, listen. When I was driving over here, I was like, when I see her, I'm gonna give her a hug. She's not gonna know why, but I was gonna give her a big hug
Aw.
because I just was feeling emotional on the way over here, which is not how I expected to feel.
Right.
I didn't expect that in the book.
Yeah. I mean, I think to a certain degree, my hope with offering it wasn't to like convert people, like it was, that's far from, I'm just
Yeah,
not
that's clear,
evangelical. But I did want to offer a pathway towards healing because I think, you know, and for everyone to find their own pathway, whatever that is, and however that makes you, you know, but to acknowledge that we need it, right? And I think sometimes we internalize this violence so much, like, you know, especially like people of color, but like everyone, like we're all a product of a system of, you know, chattel slavery and genocide and violence, and like that is deeply embedded in our DNA,
Absolutely.
right? And like we just wrote through the world without actually healing what that is. And so the pathway of healing was an offering to be able to not just give you this horrifying fact of excited delirium syndrome that we know we need to tackle, that we know there's a problem that's out there, that there's a continued medicalization of police violence,
Absolutely.
that even without the
I love that phrasing,
syndrome,
by the way. That's the first time I ever read that phrasing. Medicalization of police violence.
right, this like, right, and we see it, right, it's still happening, even though they don't use the term excited delirium anymore, it's still happening. And so that is not going to stop now that we've discovered that they did this. So it's like, I wanted something that would allow us to continue to at least take a deep breath after this book, you know, and find that pathway. And you know what, honestly, grandmothers are one of the one of the, you know, like I end with mothers, right? Because and so there's a reason for that. Like I'm a mother, and like how do I let my children like continue, especially with like the violence and loss that like our family has encountered, right?
It's crazy. This has nothing to do with the book necessarily, but it does and it doesn't. So I was thinking about this. I was talking to my wife about it, and then I thought I was gonna call my mom. My mom called me twice a day for no particular reason. I don't know why. And she left me a text message, and this is the crazy part. She's like, I can't remember my mom's birthday and the day she passed. So my grandmother passed in the house that my mom lives in, and then my grandfather passed in the house that my mom lives in.
Wow.
And then I just was finishing this, and I was going back and I was reading through this, and I was like, what is happening all of a sudden? It makes me, I don't know how I feel, but it makes me feel something that I have sort of forgotten or given up on. I remember a deep and abiding connection to a sense of something beyond me before that I had just kind of maybe credentialed out of me. I don't know, maybe that's the best. You discuss this in a way that I think is very useful. You give us a lot here in this book. You should be very proud of what you produced.
Thank you. Thank
You
you
know,
so much.
I look forward to teaching this book. I can see it being taught in many different ways, from many different perspectives, but all positive.
Thank
So
you.
I appreciate
My
it.
goodness. Well, thank you so much. I'm so grateful.
Thank you. So I don't know if you all have questions, but she's here to, you know, it's rare that you get the scholar here to answer them. So
Yeah, I guess I'm wondering, I mean, it seems like you're touching on the dangers of bureaucracy or the administrative state, how it can take something that had a visceral aesthetic to it and make it kind of disappear for, you know, most of the population. How would you say you develop a sense of urgency? Because a lot of people are feeling pessimistic,
Yeah.
and that urgency is hard to develop without fostering reactionary attitudes. I'm around a lot of reactionary circles,
Yeah.
and they say all these things we've been doing for decades. All of a sudden, there's these terms of you
Yeah.
know systemic brutality or something. conspiracy, saying, oh, there's some conspiracy, there's some cultural Marxism, there's something that's causing all of this to occur. So how do you develop urgency while also bringing outsiders into the fold, I guess?
Yeah, that's a tricky one, right? I mean, I think it's hard to know, you know, how people are going to identify or not with a text, right? And I think what I did hope to do was to speak to people in a way that could translate complex, because I feel like social scientists, we actually do have a lot of useful tools, but oftentimes those are kind of contained within academic spaces or very, very elite spaces, and don't really get translated across because of the way that we write, right? And it's like a kind of elitism, and I know you don't do this, but I know but there is a lot of people
Absolutely.
that reproduce that kind of like, and to a certain degree, there's been safety in that, right? Because I think on the one hand, and we see it, like there's an attack against academics right now, an attack against critical thinking, right? More broadly, and so, you know, it's not without warrant that that there's like a lot of fear. And at the same time, you know, I always write for my children, and like, for me, it's like when you have children, you know, or even younger generations, like they have to have something to look forward to, right? Like if you get caught in nihilism and pessimism, like what are they going to build upon, right? And so I'm always trying to think ahead. And one of the reasons when I was talking about with my husband about this is he was saying, you know, I grew up during the era in the 80s and 90s where it was like the satanic panic really made it difficult for our family, right? Because Afro-Cuban religions were heavily policed and criminalized, and people's children were being taken away because of Child Protective Services, and I detail that in the book because Wheatley is involved in that, of course, right? But what was interesting about that is, you know, in order for future generations to not have to go through those same types of panics, like we actually have to have the courage, our generation has to have the courage to be able to like speak out and normalize things that have become hidden. And so for me to speak out and put my own positionality out there is an offering for my own children to be able to one day not have to feel that same fear, you know, growing up in an alternative practice or so on. That's like, you know, so, you know, in terms of like the police, question around police, engaging with police and how to deal with police reform, it's been really interesting because a lot of the police officers who I've spoken to are like, oh yeah, that excited delirium thing, that sounded crazy to me always, like it never made sense. Paramedics have said that too, like there's a lot of pushback even within the communities of people, and that's what ethnography does.
Yeah.
It humanizes people, right?
Right.
And we hear like people who are like, no, this has always been, you know, some kind of crazy thing. And so that gives me hope too, like those people, like the guy who introduced the bill in California is an ex-police officer turned politician. And he was like, if people die from restraint-related asphyxiation, it should be on their death certificate,
Right.
not some fake syndrome, right? So that gives me hope as well. Yes.
I would just say too that I didn't expect to feel a charge to go do things, but you know, thinking about your question also, I also have this question oftentimes when I'm reading social science,
Yeah.
particularly around punishment, like what am I supposed to do, and
Yeah.
what can I do that's meaningful?
Yeah.
But this really forced me to want to grapple with things I had pushed away. I don't know if it doesn't feel like you meant to do that. I mean, let's just say it like that. It doesn't feel like you overtly said, I'm going to encourage you to go want to do a set of things.
Yeah.
But you just don't come away feeling like you could just do nothing.
Well, that's the blueprint.
Yeah. So I was like really impressed.
Thank you.
And I knew you were smart, so I was like, oh, this, you know. But I just did not. I was really I was surprised, one, because, I had never heard of that term, but also because it left me with so many other kinds of impressions. And one of them being to pick up and decide, okay, what can I do now?
And that's the blueprint, right?
Yeah.
That's actually, so it is a call.
Yeah.
It is embedded in there, the call. The call for us to do it in our own ways is to really to dismantle these practices, but also to then build forward, right? And what Du Bois taught us is, we can create new institutions, we can make those changes, we can create solidarity movements, we can create, democracies based off of abolitionist principles, right? That is a future that we can do together. And those things should be both practical, but also collaborative, right? And there's a lot of people that are doing that work too, that we don't, think about in those ways. And then the alternative epistemologies that are doing it, right, as well.
Right.
So, yeah. Yes, Nye.
Going back to your comment about what Du Bois said,
Mhm.
one of the, and as you were just saying, with the simplicimatics, saying, well, that never really made sense.
Yeah,
The training piece and the understanding piece,
that's right.
Mhm.
without being able to extirpate all of the racism, all of the built-in bias, because it isn't the reason why people are going to say, well, black men or brown men have this tendency just to up and die. No one ever said, well, how many cops are kneeling on me? Oh, 0.
Mm.
Yeah,
But 9 of them are on you.
yeah,
Right.
You up and die because
Yeah.
because of positional asphyxia.
right,
I'm allowed to sit down and talk it out like men.
Yeah.
In parentheses, white men.
yeah,
And no one ever looked at that context, and it's
Yeah.
really difficult. I mean, I saw you mentioned Elijah McClain's case.
yeah,
Even now, which was reopened after George Floyd,
yep,
they could not recognize that
Yeah.
it wasn't the police or the medics. It was a combination, so you've got,
Yeah.
so it isn't a conspiracy, I mean, it is a conspiracy.
Right.
But it isn't, it's
Yeah.
the cumulative effect, and that's the part that I find
that's the structural.
very difficult
Yeah,
to break apart the structural,
Yeah.
because the different entities, there's no legal precedent.
no,
So then the legal system isn't looking to come in and start investigating what the medical
Yeah.
examiner's done. Here,
right,
the doctor who is at Hennepin County
yeah,
was both a suburban sheriff volunteer and an expert for taser.
yeah,
He was the one who was teaching the cops and the medics.
yeah, exactly,
And even as you say, after he was said you can't say excited delirium,
Yeah.
the last training, he was basically doing
Yeah.
this.
yep,
And
exactly.
so, and the bigger point is the cops don't understand
Yeah.
that either someone is on stimulants,
Yep,
which means they're not gonna be rational,
yeah,
or you're gonna put somebody in a hypoxic response,
Right.
and
Yeah.
two of them together are gonna lead to death.
that's right.
And
Yeah.
I have heard of it.
Right.
But I
Yeah.
think that's one of the
Yeah.
things when we talk about it, and I don't have any of this, the spiritual
Yeah, yeah.
Context for it,
Yeah,
but that's why I'm so interested in the book is
yeah,
how do you get the conversation for people who are not able to recognize
That's
all
right.
their implicit bias?
Mm.
exactly, and I think what's important, so what's important, I think, is a multi-pronged approach that both, on the one hand, deals with implicit bias, but that's not at all, right? Implicit bias is still, to a certain degree, relying too heavily on individual actions rather than structural problems, right? And what I want through this book for us to see is the multi-layered and interconnected networks of medical, legal, and law enforcement that all function together through Excited Delirium. And the reason why that is important, because I think, and this is, my humble offering, I don't mean this to sound monumentalist, but the only way we can really, really try to change the status quo of racial violence in this country is an acknowledgement and a repair at the same time. And that has never happened, right? And we don't, and because that's never happened, right? So in Germany, there has been active acknowledgement and repair that has done, that has been at all levels of, educational, government, and institutional change. That is the kind of really cohesive and targeting multiple institutions together that is what needs to happen. Rather, what we have here is these piecemeal efforts that are done, obviously through grassroots organizing and activism and so on. But what happened after George Floyd's, murder was, I think, a global acknowledgement. Something deep inside of everyone woke up and said, actually, this is happening, and we have to, and so that moment of a global acknowledgement, like, that is a moment we can seize upon, right? That I think, sure, there's like the deniers and so on, but I think there's just like you have to have that. And when you do that, then you can do broad institutional and structural change at all levels. And I do think it has to happen like across the board, and not just in one area, not just targeting policing, not just targeting, medical, but educational, governmental, medical practices. And that's not just like there's a rhetoric around like DEI initiatives that I think is really troubling and problematic. But part of it has to do with the fact that DEI is not credentialized enough to do the work it needs to do. And so it all is symbolic, and it all focuses on implicit bias as the kind of target. And the reason why is because there's just a blatant ignoring of like structural, in these other interrelated elements. So for me, I'm not saying that's like a one-stop fix, because obviously that's not, but I do think that that kind of a concerted effort has never been done in the United States. And that's, obviously this book is, one of the things that I think happens in this book for people who had not heard of Excited Delirium is there's a sense that the medical is always useful and helpful, that the medical is kind of implicitly benign, and that if there's something bad that happens, it's an accident or something went wrong, but it's not like inherently bad. Medical is, it's a good thing. But I think what this shows us is that no, we actually have to fundamentally change the medical institution as well, and the way that medical institutions and these other kinds of deeply white supremacist institutions must be rethought, right? And there's a lot of great social science work out there on how to do that. So we're not for lack of like
Absolutely.
the knowledge. It's the implementation and the desire, I think, right? And a cultural shift that has to happen in order for that acknowledgement to really take hold. But we did see that after the death of George Floyd, which is why like Minneapolis is really important, right?
Did you get to Quinn and Anderson in your research?
I mentioned it at the end, but it was after the book was already, so I just, but again, with the thing about Quinn and Anderson, right, it basically was Excited Delirium, right? They basically labeled him an Excited Delirium without the term, right? And it's like, so it's another example like Tyson as well, right? There's a number of folks who have been, killed recently that are still being medicalized, right? The violence is still being medicalized.
I think we've hit the end here, so
Thank you.
I just want to say thank you again.
Thank you.
Everybody give her a round of applause for the really
Thank you guys
outstanding book.
for coming.
Thank you all so much for coming, and she'll be in the front.
Yes.
So.
Okay.